One set. Just one set.
Going from one set to two sets is the biggest mistake you could possibly make. It's not just a mistake, it's the biggest mistake possible.
One ring to rule them all.
Wouldn't it be incredible, wouldn't it be amazing if you could maximize your muscular gains by just doing one set to failure and no more? In fact, doing more would be worse. The idea is so tempting, so tantalizing. In fact, I think the idea probably drove Mike Mentzer crazy. It might have also been the math, but definitely the allure, the solidity of that idea, just the knowledge, the certainty that you would always be doing the right thing, and that right thing happens to be the least amount of work you could do. What a magical, wonderful world that would be. Today, I want to explore that world. I want to explore the world of high-intensity training as advocated by people like Mike Mentzer and Dorian Yates. I want to take their claims seriously. I want to try to understand what they're advocating, why they think that only doing one set to failure is optimal, and then I want to explore some alternatives and give you practical suggestions to make sure you're getting the most out of your training. So let's dive in. This video is for educational entertainment purposes only. Firstly, Mike Mentzer's thinking was primarily motivated by his desire to minimize fatigue. He was concerned that lifters were doing too much. They were doing so much work that they weren't actually able to adapt. They were limiting their growth by spending too much time working in the gym. He would say things like, muscles are built outside the gym, not in the gym. And in Mike's mind, doing one set was the most optimal thing you could do. One set of an exercise to muscular failure would guarantee you would get the most gains with the least amount of fatigue. And on the surface, this idea does have some merit. Taking a set to muscular failure will guarantee that that set is as stimulative as it possibly can be. That is unequivocally true. And it is the case that some people actually do train too much. Maybe they train so much that they fail to recover, or maybe they train so much that the quality of their training declines. You can't really bash your head against a wall all day. You'll start to pull your punches. And so Mike and people like him were trying to push back against that. They wanted people to focus on quality and not quantity. And that, frankly, is good advice. Lifters should absolutely focus on quality before quantity. And I applaud his thinking there. Additionally, there is just something so alluring about only doing one set. It's very concrete. Mike Mentzer used to argue that it was scientific, that it was very logically based, because doing one set is the least amount you can do. It is objective in that sense. We're going to unpack those arguments later because they don't actually hold up to scrutiny, but I do want to acknowledge just how tempting of a concept that is. Doing one of something is just very concrete and tangible. It is a clear, concise answer, and people like clear, concise answers. I think a big part of the reason why HIT training has still persisted is because it just speaks to something within people. It provides them with a black and white paradigm, a very clear set of ironclad rules. And for some people, that actually may be ideal. A huge part of training is psychology, is your own mentality. And if you're not someone who deals well with ambiguity and lots of options, a highly restrictive training system, like a high-intensity training system, might actually be optimal for you because it makes sense to you and it gives you the opportunity to perform at your best. And I don't want to discount that here. However, if we dive into this concept, we can see that it doesn't really hold up. Firstly, I want to look at it from a practical perspective. So if the rule is we do one set to muscular failure per each exercise, this begs the question, how many exercises should we do? And if you try to really think this through, there's no way to do it in a manner that's logically consistent. So for example, let's say you're looking at the barbell back squat and you want to take a squat to failure. Well, if you fail on a squat, did your quads fail? Did your lower back fail? Did your glutes fail? It was probably some combination of factors. And that means that each of those muscle groups is probably receiving a different stimulus. They're not all failing at the same point. And you can't really say that you took all of those muscle groups to momentary muscular failure. It's just not true. So I guess that means that when we're training in this fashion, we have to only do isolation exercises, only single joint exercises. Well, frankly, that's just not possible. For example, if you think about your back musculature, you can't really train your rhomboids without involving your traps. You probably can't really train your rear delts without training other portions of the mid-back. You can't really train your lats without involving other portions of the back, maybe your biceps. Again, these muscle groups are just too interrelated. And so that means that we are always, in some form or fashion, going to be doing more than one set per muscle group because we can't separate all these muscles. So this paradigm in practice, if we're being logically consistent, is totally unworkable. It's also arbitrary in the sense that failure isn't always consistently defined. Mike and Dorian Yates used to do set extenders. They would take sets beyond failure. And once you're going beyond failure, then how do you know when to stop? Can't you just keep going beyond failure? Right, if your lifting partner is helping you with those last final reps, couldn't you just keep getting more and more and more help? Where do you stop? Once you've passed failure, you've removed this concept of an objective notion of where the set should stop. So again, this is not logically consistent. And lastly, how often are you supposed to perform these exercises? Mike again changed his thinking here. He didn't always do the same thing. I believe towards the end of his life, he was actually advocating that people train once every 2 weeks, which I think to anyone who's ever set foot in a gym ever will immediately sound ridiculous. But this problem again speaks to the inconsistency of this paradigm. All it really tells us what to do is to take sets to failure, but it doesn't tell us how many sets to do, because of course you can do as many exercises or as little as you want, and it doesn't tell us how often to do it. There's really no framework for these other variables, and these other variables are incredibly important. So while I applaud Mike Mentzer's emphasis on quality here, I just don't think there's enough substance here to actually have a real training system. And frankly, this makes sense because again, Mike changed his thinking and trained differently over times. Dorian certainly trained differently from Mike. And in general, people who adopt this philosophy implement it in different ways. So while I agree with the core concept that your sets should be of high quality, the rest can largely be discarded. Let's dive in a bit here and really think about what's going on here and what Mike is trying to argue. Mike is saying that doing one iteration of a task is the most optimal number of iterations of that given task. If you take a step back and just try to think that through, does that actually make sense? Is that consistent with any other element of human performance? For example, if you were teaching someone how to throw a baseball, would you tell them to just throw that ball once? If you were teaching someone how to hit a golf ball, would you tell them just to swing that club once? No, you absolutely wouldn't. And okay, you say, look, those aren't maximal efforts. Well, if someone were sprinting, if they were doing all-out sprints, would you just tell them to do one all-out sprint in a session and absolutely no more? No, you'd have them do more. This is how we train athletes. Again, fatigue is important, recovery is important, but this notion that human beings can only adapt to one of a thing is just objectively untrue because we see so many other counterexamples in real life. If we zoom out, another good example is the football athlete. Football players are big and strong and muscular. No one can argue with that. That is the archetypal football player. And football players will train and practice for hours upon hours in a day, and they continually grow bigger and stronger. Yes, they're not as big as bodybuilders, but they're still huge and powerful and hulking. And if it were truly the case that just doing one iteration of something, even to failure, was so demanding of the body that you couldn't recover, how then are these athletes continuing to get bigger and stronger? It just doesn't really make sense in the real world. In fact, if we think about human biology, the inverse is far more likely to be true. The best analogy I can give you is that of getting a tan. So a couple years ago, I went to Egypt. I was near the Egypt and Sudanese border. You can see I'm relatively tan, but when I was there, I was out in the sun without sunscreen for about 20 minutes and I got burned. Why is that? Well, though I'm used to seeing the sun, I'm not used to being exposed to equatorial sunlight, and that damaged my skin. So I think it's objectively true that a lesser amount of sunlight, perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps 5 minutes, wouldn't have burned my skin, and a greater amount of sunlight would have burned my skin, right? That makes perfect sense. And so let's think this through. If I wanted to get as tan as possible, if I wanted to adapt to the greatest extent to that sunlight, what would I do? Well, I would expose myself to a certain amount of sunlight, and then I would slowly increase that exposure over time. I would increase the number of sets I was doing. So maybe I would start out with 5 minutes and then go up to 10 and then 15 and then 20 and then 25, etc. And at some point, my level of exposure would peak. The number of sets I was doing would peak. Maybe it would take an hour, maybe it would take 2. I don't know, that's not the point of this. But the point is that during this scenario, at no point was there ever a single arbitrary unit of volume that was the most optimal. Instead, as my body adapted and changed, my needs changed as well. And I think that analogy applies perfectly to muscle building. It is totally possible for some people in their lifting journey that 1 set to failure is in fact the most optimal amount of volume for them to perform. And I bet for those people, their volume needs will also change over time. I'm not saying that they need to do an infinite amount of sets. I'm not saying that they need to do 52 sets. I am saying that generally speaking, people's volume needs can change over time, and more importantly, if you are not growing, if you are stuck, one of the best ways to spur additional growth is to increase your volume. And if we adopt a high intensity training paradigm that demands we only ever do 1 set, we are removing that option. We are taking that tool out of our toolbox, and that just doesn't make sense. Here I'm actually speaking from personal experience, because at this point in my lifting career, I actually do a lot of single sets. Not for every exercise, but for many of the exercises I do, I only do 1 set to failure, followed by a rest pause set. And I do this for 2 primary reasons. 1, I am super fucking busy and I don't have a lot of time. And so I want to get the most out of every set, and I want to maximize my time in the gym. I'm probably sacrificing some amount of muscular growth by adopting this approach, but I think it's pretty minimal and it works with my lifestyle and my recovery capabilities. And secondly, and more importantly, I like this paradigm because it allows me to adjust my training as needed. If I start out doing 1 set and my gains start to plateau, then I know that if I add an additional set, that is likely to spur progress. And so if you conceptualize my training like an experiment, in fact, it is actually more valid, because when I encounter an issue, I just change 1 variable. I just add 1 set. And if adding that 1 set spurs progress, then I know that's what I needed. And so the reason why I like this is not because it's optimal, but because it provides a clear conceptual framework for problem solving. It lets me run the scientific experiment of my training more ruthlessly and efficiently. And I think it's great for that purpose. The key point I want to emphasize here in closing is that quality matters. Many people do waste time in the gym performing low effort sets that are nowhere near failure. If you're doing so much volume that you're not actually performing meaningful sets, strip back some of that work. Do less and focus on getting the most out of the least. If you can adopt that mindset and simultaneously discard the parts of Mentzer's thinking that just don't make sense, I promise you, you will have more options and more ways to make sure you are making the most gains in your training. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this video useful, please don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Appreciate you.